Welcome everyone to a new episode of Tales of the LGBTQ+. My name is Douglas Parsons. A few weeks ago on the Tales of the LGBTQ+ Facebook page and group, Jay from the Fitness Geek Collective podcast and I announced the very first giveaway to the fans. Jay is giving 6 weeks of one-on-one fitness training to 4 fans beginning on May 3rd. He will work with us on meal plans and individual workouts so we can reach a 6-week goal. The date for the entry submissions is over, unfortunately. However, I'm very happy to say that Mary Guthrow Saby, Jan Peter, Brian Deacon, and Corey Clanky will be joining me in this life-changing journey. A huge thank you to Jay for this amazing opportunity. Please check out his podcast titled The Fitness Geek Collective to hear more about the amazing world of fitness and how you can be more motivated. I also want to give a shout out to the following people who have helped the Tales of the LGBTQ+ podcast get started through their financial contribution. I know, financial contribution. We have a Buy Me a Coffee website, and this allows people to buy us a one-time virtual coffee or to sign on for a monthly membership. Through monthly membership, you will receive extras not available elsewhere. All of the money raised goes towards the weekly mixing, sound, and editing that our maestro Jack White does. I know, not that Jack White. But this Jack White is very talented, nevertheless. Thank you to Doug Gilbert, Sue Oguchi, Caitlin, Doug, and Sylvia Parsons, Holly Staniski, and our very own Robert Hamilton and Scott Bryan for the virtual coffees you have bought recently for us. In addition, a big thank you has to go out to Jody Cuff, Jake Sheffer, in addition to Pam and Karen Hoffman, for signing on for monthly memberships. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. This is a love letter to the community. This is what will allow us to keep sharing these stories and putting them out to the world. Now finally, my guest for today, Candas Jane Dorsey. In 2018, Candas was inducted into the Canadian Science Fiction and Fantasy Association Hall of Fame. She is the award-winning author of titles Black Wine, A Paradigm of Earth, and many other worlds. Recently, she has spread her wings and released her first mystery novel titled The Adventures of Isabel. And her fans eagerly awaited sequel, What's the Matter with Mary Jane, which will be released later on this season, probably in the fall. Today on Tales of the LGBTQ+, join me as I have a conversation with poet and author Candas Jane Dorsey. This conversation starts right now. Candas, I'm excited to talk to you about your life and your writing. You've colored me intrigued. How are you doing tonight?
Very well, thank you. All things considered, yes. And you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing extremely well. I'm not going to ask you why you write because those questions I find are terrible because everyday life you gather things. I'm really interested though with you finding your voice in your writing. Was there a particular book or was there something that you wrote when you said to yourself, okay, I'm finding myself within my writing. It's making sense to me. I know why I'm doing this.
That's an interesting question because I think the answer is no, but um, it makes me think about the weird combination of tentativeness and ego that creative artists have to have. Um, you're tentative because you're wondering if it's right or if you're getting it right or if people will like it or whatever. But there's also kind of an ego that makes you do it in the first place. And I think that the relationship between those two types of ego, the sort of external ego that's affected by others and the internal one that creates the pressure to to make things. I think that tension between them can occur in different people in different places. And for me, uh, when I wrote what I wrote, whether anybody liked it or not. The issue of sort of getting it out into the world or marketing or making it known is an external issue. But I would have written the same things no matter what, because that's what wants to get out. That's what pushes to get out. So the things that affected me didn't so much affect my voice as they affected my preoccupations. And I think to explain that, I'm going to take two steps back. I'm going to quote something out of there's a guy called Robert McKee who wrote a book called Story, which is, as far as I'm concerned, even though it's a book about film writing, about screenwriting, I think it should be essential reading for novelists as well. And in this book, he either said or quoted someone as saying, "Theme is the writerly perspective on the significance of the story." Now, when I read that, I had this aha moment in which I suddenly realized that, and I tell my students, my writing students this too, you don't actually have to worry about why you're writing the thing, or about whether you have a valid voice, because who you are will inform the thing you do, whether you do it consciously or not. The things that people choose to write about at the very start are informed by who they are. One person wants to write a romance novel and another person wants to write a horror novel. And if you gave them two character names, immediately they would diverge into those two areas. That's something kind of inherent. That's something that comes from all of their experience to that moment. So for me, I always knew that I would write whatever was pressing to get out. The thing that changed, I think, was that I had certain key experiences that affected who I am. So, for instance, my first serious job, I had a lovely job in a bookstore, but my first sort of not part-time, real job, as they say, was as a child care worker for 4 years between when I was 20 and 24 in a home for, in a residential facility for teenage girls. So I saw kids between the ages of 11 and 18. And some of them were there because they had done criminal things or had serious issues. And some of them were there for societal reasons, like they were girls who swore, and in the 1970s that was a bad thing, or they ran away from foster homes, and history revealed eventually that they were being abused in those foster homes, but at that time the identified patient was the runaway, right? The bad girl who ran, and so on. So I saw a lot of, for want of a better word, injustice. I saw a lot of infuriating things. I saw kids who were kind of the fallout of the 60s scoop and who ended up in care, Indigenous kids who ended up in care at a much higher level. I saw kids who'd been treated horribly in their families and extended families, and sometimes no one had rescued them until they were in their teens, and they would run away, and then they would be seen as the one who needed to go into an institution. But as you started to explore their stories, you began to realize that they had been extraordinarily brave and valiant warriors in an environment of great horror and misery. So just 4 years of that, I think, completely altered my relationship to my world. I came out of financially lower middle class, but in terms of the arts and so on, basically very middle class and very cultured environment, but also very white as it was in the 50s and 60s. I was born in the 50s. 50s and 60s in Edmonton were the classic definition of white hegemony and clusters of marginalized people who really were on the margins. So from that, at the age of I moved out at the age of 18, but from the age of 20 when I got this job, up till then I had been whiny, to be honest. I'd been whiny about, oh, my parents were mean to me, right? I then saw people whose parents really had been mean to me. I saw a girl whose stepfather had, when she was an infant, had fried her in a frying pan. That was the worst thing. And the cool thing was that the mother called the cops on the guy, got rid of him. And so for this girl, that was just a story about why she had scars on her back. But there were other kids there who had been systematically and systemically abused all their lives. And they ended up at the age of 11 or 12 or 14 in care with unrepairable wounds that had been inflicted on them by the people who they were supposed to be able to trust. And when I look at my own environment after that, all I felt was just this abiding thankfulness and gratitude that I had been given such love and such support that I was able to develop into a person who maybe would have the strength to help those kids. And from that point on, from the rage and the sorrow and the just, basically anger was the predominant feeling. Like, this is so wrong. And the empathy that probably has fueled my voice for the rest of my career, because you can't forget it. You can't. It changes you completely and irrevocably, and that change keeps happening. We keep discovering more about heteronormativity and its evil twin, homophobia, its evil twin, transphobia, monogamy, and its evil twin, prejudice against other types of relationships, racism, and its evil twin, of course, like the bigotry part of it. But racism is all around us, and so you start to, if you don't remain open to that, then you can solidify one kind of voice, if you will. But as an artist, I think you have to remain vulnerable to those things. So it bothers me just as much at the age that I am today when I realize how much we were lied to, for instance, about racism in Canada. How the basis of my happy childhood utopia was on the backs of other people who were discriminated against, that sort of thing. That bothers me as much today as it did in 1973, when I was dealing with these wonderful kids who were treated so horribly. So if there's a thing that informs how I write, it's kind of that anger. And I won't say I found that voice. I would say that that's what my voice turned into.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. There's a lot that you just were saying that, we can build out of it with questions, and so much I would like to know. One word, though, that you mentioned was change. And I like to pursue that a little bit because with your career, you had the title of being a poet, your speculative fiction, which was both yourself in writing but editing, and as you mentioned, your company that you had for this decade period of time, where you're winning awards, you're gaining great fame. However, November of last year, you surprised people by releasing a mystery novel. So once again, you're changing and your voice is changing. Now, there's a couple of things about your mystery novel that I find very interesting. One is that you wrote it from beginning to end, which is very different from what most authors do. But you sat down not knowing what the end game was going to be, and you just wrote. So I'm interested in that. But I'm also interested in the fact that your main character for this mystery does not have a name, does not, it's not revealed. And so that plays into that identity or that issue of who is this person, male, female, what have you. And so I'm really interested in first, why now have you become a mystery writer? And with that, how the characters itself, were you surprised by you not naming the main character at the when you dotted the last period of your book?
Okay, well, there's lots of questions in those questions. So let me just dive in.
There's lots there.
John Gardner, who was a famous writer but also writing teacher, wrote a book called The Art of Writing that people use a lot and so on. He also wrote a book called On Moral Fiction, and his thesis in that book was that certain types of narrative were what he called moral fictions, not because they scolded you or taught ethical lessons or whatever, but because their preoccupation was in the difference between right and wrong, how that plays out, and whether right will triumph in the end. So he listed several genre fictions as moral fictions, and they were mystery, fantasy, and romance. And because he said a lot of fantasy is about right and wrong, or might versus right, or a quest for rightness, or to put things back in order in the world, to go up against the bad guy with your sword, and or with your tiny little hobbit with his ring, and the ring eventually. I mean, we all laugh today about one does not just walk into Mordor, but um, what Tolkien did in that thing, which was a really formative narrative, was he took the smallest, most vulnerable person and put them up against all the forces of evil. And so he was doing a moral experiment in whether right, tiny little rightness, could go up against large evils. And certainly in today's world, in the United States under Trump, in Alberta at the moment, we see the same kind of question. Can we as individuals go up against big institutions that are pressing down with systemic injustices?
Mhm.
In mystery, the journey is taken in response to um, an affront to the state of being human, because most mysteries are about murders, and murder is a very interesting crime. If you look at what it costs to investigate a murder in our society, it goes up into the millions of dollars.
Hmm.
So a person who, as a living person, is almost deemed by society to be worthless, a homeless person or a drug dealer, or the kind of people who are discriminated against every day for things they do, or people who do bad things. I mean, you can be considered the least worthy member of society, and yet if you are murdered, $2 or $3 million might get spent on finding out who killed you.
Hmm.
Why is that? That's because the murder didn't just kill you. The murderer went up against all of humanity's belief that we have worth and that our lives have worth, right? So a murder mystery is a quest for justice to be done and to be seen to be done. And I have to point out that there are dystopian murders where, like the Mr. Ripley books, where the bad guy gets away with it. But the reader understands the wrongness, right? So it's in the reader's mind that that journey of understanding justice and how justice should be takes place. So in a certain way, much of what I've been writing has been grappling with this issue of moral fiction and of justice in action. So it's not that surprising that I might have wanted to play around with one. But also I read an immense number of mysteries and have all my life. Since I was a little kid, my parents and I would go to the library and we'd have these big stacks of books. And then when we'd come home, everyone in the house would read all the books up to their level of reading. So I started reading at an adult level very early, grade 3. And we just read all the books all the time. And then there was often discussion about the books, but there were certain favorite kinds. My dad was a science fiction nut. In his later days, he used to binge watch Doctor Who all night when he had insomnia and that sort of thing. So I read science fiction with him, and I read mystery with my mom. And all around us were these types of books. So in my head, there were no genres. There were just all the books. And I was actually kind of surprised and affronted when I became a published writer to discover that people only wanted to see certain kinds of books. And I've actually given a lecture where I likened, in my past, where I've likened my inability to perceive genre to my inability to get interested in gender either. Because, of course, the lovely wordplay genre, gender, right? Because I truly think there is just good writing or bad writing. And if it's bad, it doesn't matter how many literary pretensions it has, it's still bad. And if it's good, it doesn't really matter whether it's marketed as a mystery or science fiction or whatever. And, you know, we see writers get in trouble for that, like Margaret Atwood. Oh my gosh, you wrote a science fiction novel. Well, you either wrote a good novel or you wrote a bad novel, right? Atwood writes good novels, by and large. So, you know, The Handmaid's Tale deserved all the attention it got, right? And it didn't matter if it was futuristic or not. So for me to sit down and write and choose mystery, it had lots of precedence. The other thing, though, I need to say is I started playing with this mystery a long time before it actually came out. And part of the issue was that I was writing a great looming serious novel, as I call it. Was just like, you know, like it was a big shadow on the wall, you know, it was dark, it was difficult, it had a tough voice. And in the meanwhile, life was getting a little bit dark and looming too. And I wasn't really in the mood to both be diving into that world and writing and having to live through it in my life. And I realized after the fact that this was part of why I kind of broke loose and went over that away and just started writing something. But I started it initially as another attempt at the 3-day novel contest. And I had won that in 1986 with Nora Abercrombie. And one of the things we learned was that you have to just start at the beginning and keep writing. You have to not be precious about the writing. And so I kind of wanted to bring that lesson of less preciousness and more fun back into my work. So I just sat down and I started to type on one September weekend, you know, when they have this competition, Labor Day weekend. And something interrupted me that was like quite serious, and so I didn't go back to it, but I had this little snippet. So when I started getting, you know, trying to kind of get out of this doomsome place that I went back to this little snippet and I just kept typing away at it. And I began to realize that this could be, you know, I had to give my character something to do, right? Because otherwise it's boring. It's like I will lie around for 350 pages in the bathtub and think about my thoughts. forget about it. So then I introduced the murder, and please help me, friend, come and help me get this murder paid attention to. And then I thought, well, maybe I have to have some clues. So I sat down and kind of thought, well, what are a list of 10 clues that would work in a mystery? And let me give myself 10 of them and see how that works out. And so I was giving myself little puzzles. I was enjoying, it's a very smart-ass kind of voice that the narrator has. And when you write a first-person narrator, you never have to give them a name. And how often, really, does anyone call you by your name?
Only when we're in trouble.
Seriously, unless they're just meeting you, or unless they're, calling you from another room and there are a choice of 6 people and they want you specifically, or what. So that's one thing. But the other thing is there is a tradition in the mystery world, especially in sort of American mystery, of the nameless detective. What's his name? Dashiell Hammett's detectives didn't have names, right? Or at least one. Yeah. And there are other sort of nameless, that kind of California noir thing has several different detectives who didn't have any names. They would just, they would say my name was on the door in gold leaf, but they wouldn't say what the name was. Or someone would come in and after we introduce ourselves, this would happen, kind of thing, right? And people who saw them come in would say, oh, it's you, right? And so there was just never anything. So I thought, well, okay, why not? So I had fun, and in fact, I wrote the last little bit of it very early. That's my exception to the rule, because I was also having fun with using the poem "The Adventures of Isabel," which is a child's poem by Ogden Nash. He originally wrote it for his daughter, whose name is Isabel. Isabel defeats a giant and a witch and a nasty doctor, and without sort of losing her cool. So I was using these lines, and so at the end I wanted to have this little moment where somebody says to the protagonist, is your name Isabel? And she says, no, why do you ask? Because, it will make a great joke. So I made sure to write that down so I wouldn't forget it. But other than that, it was just like, let's see how this develops. And in the end, it became a thing I did for fun.
It's fantastic. So, The Adventures of Isabel was released in November, and now you've got uh, the sequel coming out again in the fall.
Look at that. Look at those pretty shiny boots. Sorry.
The
Yeah.
follow up is What's the Matter with Mary Jane? And I just want to say that you showed everyone on your Facebook the cover. These are stunning covers for these books itself. And then there will be another book coming out next year. Do do these books follow the same character throughout? Like excellent. And does one need to read the first book in order to understand the second book or the third book, like an L.R. Wright or an Ian Rankin type style?
No and yes. The first and second book aren't that deeply connected, but as I write, I'm actually working on the third book right now. Remind me of all my stresses, will you? I'm working on the third book right now, and it's more related to the second book. But if I go so far as to have a fourth book, it will be unrelated again.
Hmm.
What the third book is doing is it's tying up some loose ends that aren't that visible in the second book as you read it, but they were bothering me.
Yes.
And so I worked on them. Plus the thing I wanted to do in the third book was a lot of fun, but completely impossible. Because I wanted my detective to go into a prison, into a men's prison, um, undercover, pretending to be uh, a transsexual. right, pretending to be, or at least pretending to be someone in drag who then was forced to stay in the men's side, even though it misgendered. But, of course, completely impossible. For one thing, a lot of modern prisons take take trans issues into account and house people specifically according to express gender and so on. And if they don't, they should, or that there's quite a pressure to do that. But secondly, because no one in law enforcement would ever let a civilian enter that kind of situation, ever. So it was a fun idea, but the second that I realized it was impossible, I had to figure out how to get to the same place a different way, and so that involved a lot of thinking about this, because one of the murders takes place in a prison. So
What I found it interesting in doing some research for this is that I don't know if it's a yearly thing or biannual, but there's an opportunity for writers to be able to have conversations with lawyers, police, people in power, and run ideas by them to say, is it possible? Could this happen? I did not, I was naive to that as taking place before, but has that always been?
it's marvelous. It happens a lot, and sometimes it's informal. Like I worked as part of my queer community advocacy. I was actually on the police liaison committee for 17 years. So I met a lot of cops. And I met the kind of cops who would be mad at bad cops most of the time. Most of the time I wasn't meeting cops who had really negative attitudes, especially in the early part. And when I started in 1994, being on that committee, there were a lot of cops who were, there were still cops on the force who'd been at the Pisces Health Club raid in 1980, and when Michael Fair was arrested as a found-in and so on. And they were still completely, pardon the expression, unwoke. They were completely, they kept all their prejudices with them to the end, and all you could hope for at that time was for them to get old enough to retire and to have a new batch that were better human beings. But I also saw the kind of cops who were furious at other police officers' wrongdoings. And so it was fascinating to see the kind of cops who were drawn to policing because of power, and the kind of cops who were drawn to policing in order to make things right. And they're very different people, although they may end up saying all the same things out of their mouth. You can soon tell which is which, So it was fascinating. So when I started writing this mystery, I actually had a cop that I could consult about. There's a scene in it that involves some small undercover stuff of the sort that a civilian would get a chance to do sometimes. But how would it happen? And he was able to take me through every step. What would happen in the background? Who would have to be consulted? What kind of permissions they would have to get? What kind of regulations? How the monitoring would be done? All that stuff. So that was just personal, right? It's like, can I take you out for lunch and show you the scene, and you can tell me what's wrong with it and what would really have to happen. And then he actually agreed to read the whole book, and so he gave me some valuable feedback about the cop side of it. But I also two other things, so this won't take long. One is that I now belong to something called Sisters in Crime, which is women's mystery writers organization. And when I went to join an organization, it sounded interesting, and I could afford it. Because there's also another mystery writers organization that costs a bit more, and I'll work up to that one. But Sisters in Crime is incredibly busy all across North America, and what they mainly do for the members is organize these little webinars and seminars, which are just what you said. can we talk to a Crown prosecutor? Can we talk to a homicide detective? So I've been to a couple since I joined. One was on a Kentucky chapter of Sisters in Crime, talked to someone whose specialty was active shooter training drills, or what happens when there's an active shooter in a school or university or whatever, which is a very American thing, but very interesting. And then someone else who was a blood spatter expert, who was an FBI agent. He actually had spent 9 days cataloging evidence in the Unabomber's cabin. You remember that far back case. But he became a blood spatter expert, and so we had a little seminar on blood spatter in which he showed us actual crime scene photos and said, now look at the blood spatter. Now you tell me what happened here. And all the different people would chime in and say, did this happen? What about that? And he could draw our attention to, we'll see how the droplets do this there. So there's just every weekend, and possibly in the midweek, there are these seminars on all different aspects. I also went to one with the BC provincial court judge, and she talked about the judicial process in BC and so on. So that's something that formally goes on in the crime writers organizations. But also, I was really lucky. I had a student in one of my writing classes who was a crime analyst, and has worked for the RCMP first, and now works for a different agency. But really interesting to realize how complicated criminal investigation is, because now they have specialist crime analysts and they have special information managers. So what he did, he and I got together with some of the Edmonton crime writers, and he organized a thing where he brought in people that he worked with who were either current or retired. So he brought in pathologists, homicide investigators, crime analyst, information manager, and even a Crown prosecutor. And we all got together in his living room, actually, and ate snacks and asked questions. So that was just an ad hoc kind of thing. So there's always someone that you can ask if you have questions. And I found out in my years back when I was doing more journalism that people love to be asked about their lives and their work. So, if you need specialized information because you're writing something and you can find the right person to call, and, you can call up and say, hi, I'm Candas Jane Dorsey and I'm writing this mystery novel or crime novel, and this happens in it. So the culmination of all this was that I actually got to sit at one point in a room with 9 investigators, a crime analyst, an information manager, the head of this big investigative unit, a Crown prosecutor, and someone else, just me, and talk about my 3rd novel and what could happen or should happen. It was during lunch. I offered to cater the lunch, and they said, no, we're not allowed to accept gifts. So I got a free lunch out of it, and basically 2 hours or an hour and a half of their time focused on this idea. And it was just so great. I can't even, it was just full, and they actually gave me one idea that is absolutely a plot point. And I said to the guy that is the answer to an abiding question I have. So, people will do this if you ask them.
I'm jealous. I'm jealous of this experience. So, The Adventures of Isabel. Are we going to have a brief reading from it?
Sure, I can do that.
As we're talking here, The Adventures of Isabel. Obviously, the main character is not Isabel herself. Um, is your protagonist Jessica Fletcher, Veronica Mars type character, or does your character just fall into this?
Falls in for sure. And that's a little difficult because, there is the Jessica Fletcher problem, which is everywhere she goes, people die,
People die.
right? So, you know, uh,
I still wish that at the end of that series, Angela Lansbury would have just looked at the camera and just said, "It was me. It was me all along." I would have loved that as she walked as she bike pedaled away with the little basket. I would have loved it.
well, and there's a lot of joking in the industry I've discovered about the classic murder village, right? Like, what if you visit a classic murder village, never do these things. If you live in a classic British murder village, never do these things. And I watched a series called Brokenwood, which is New Zealand television, and it's a classic murder village television series where the protagonist is the policeman who comes from the big city to be the chief detective in this village. And they had a heck of a lot of fun writing all the classic murder village plots one after the other. And you could see they were doing it on purpose, and so, a lot of people get murdered in Brokenwood, and nobody even twitches. Nobody says, why do we have a higher murder rate than the entire New Zealand nation? No. Instead, what they do is they just straight facedly they deal with they even had one on, if you can believe it, Tauntines, which is like the Agatha Christie thing. I mean, I don't even think that people use Tauntines in law anymore, but that's the thing where if someone dies, their share is split up among the surviving heirs. And so it is a great motive for murder to be the surviving heir and get everything. But, in living memory, I don't remember people using that in law, but they had a case of it just because they could. So they had a lot of fun. So she does not live in a murder village. She lives in a city that is surprisingly similar to Edmonton in some ways, but I have transplanted different aspects of other cities in just for fun. So yeah. I don't know whether I'm not going to start at the very beginning. For one thing, there's an interview out there that the Edmonton Journal did where they had me read the beginning so people couldn't find it. But I just want to say my detective is a downsized, is a rather foul-mouthed, bisexual, downsized social worker who is just at the point where she is running out of all her options and has the last box of fish sticks out of the freezer that she's trying to share with her cat. And her cat's name used to be Fuckwit, but that was too rude when her born-again cousin Thelma came over, so she's trying to change the cat's name to Bunnywit. And Bunnywit is a Manx with catitude, and so there they are living in this apartment building, in a building called the Epitome Apartments, which everyone pronounces epitome, except her, of course, because she's a grammar nerd. And this is based on a building that Judith Merrill used to live in Toronto, which is called the Epitome, and which people did call, with no irony at all, the epitome. But in any case, so the setup is that she has a friend who's a drag queen, Denis, and Denis lives in the same little suburban crescent as a woman that they call Hep, because she looks a lot like a tiny version of the classic Katharine Hepburn with the bun. And so Hep's granddaughter is a sex worker, is a young woman, formerly addicted to drugs, trying to quit, and she's found dead. Which, I got to admit that whole thing about please don't kill any more women and don't kill any more sex workers in mysteries, I disobeyed it before I'd even heard about it, because in essence, to me, this girl is much like the kids I worked with in the old days at that institution, and utterly deserving of justice and honor. And so the grandmother wants someone to help her make sure the police stay honest and don't just write this off as, yet another street death and whatever. And so they asked our retired social worker to do this. And she can't afford to say no because she has no money left and no fish sticks left, and is, composing her ad for the personals to, to become a sex worker herself. Although that's mostly a joke, but she really is at the end of her rope. And so she agrees to take this on. And so one of the methods she uses is that she's very similar to the dead girl's name is Maddie. She's very similar to her in build and foot size. And so Maddie's girlfriend, whose name is Vicky, and she decide that they should take her out on the street and she should stand around in Maddie's tall, high-heeled boots and see if anything happens, see if anyone reacts, which is, as an investigative technique, it's quite bogus, but as an opportunity for satire, it's awesome. So I took it. So we're if you recall the poem about the adventures of Isabel, Isabel met an enormous bear is the first line. Isabel didn't care. So the bear was hungry, the bear was ravenous. And the book is divided up by numbered segments, and so this is segment 19, The Stories of the Street Are Mine. The inner city is a hungry beast, feasting on the lives of children. Jailbait pickups sucked into silver Lincoln Continentals so that sexually incontinent old tourists from the burbs can spill their worthless lust into people they consider as disposable as the condoms they use to protect themselves from infection. They drive home sated and smug, believing they've outwitted the streets once again, not knowing that the street has their number. The kids have learned much more from them than they have learned in the transaction, and unable to imagine that the human beings they leave behind as trash have more to say to the universe than their rich, white, and much more trashy clientele. I stood in a doorway in Maddie's boots, my feet and my spirit hurting. I was wondering already if this caper would cause permanent damage to both. Denis and Vicky had had a ball tarting me up. Denis had pulled out his drag gear and outfitted me with an astonishingly brief hipster microskirt and a gigantic set of eyelashes. All evening I'd felt like tent caterpillars were invading my eye sockets, but I'd managed not to counterattack yet. They'd laughed uproariously while backcombing my hair into a frightening anti-halo, and Denis convinced me that the archival stretch marks on my belly added piquancy to the view exposed by the halter top. More like poignancy, I thought, but had to admit that until someone looked closely at my heavily made-up face, they would probably take me for a well-used 28 instead of my real age. What the devil I would do if anyone got that close, I didn't know. When they were done, even I was scared by how much I looked like the Maddie in the photograph. If the right, or the wrong, people saw me, I was going to press some heavy-duty buttons, all right. Just as I had, referring to previous conversations. So regular price, $5, $5, $5. Just as I had told Hep, every third person who passed me answered to one of the descriptions she'd given, even ruling out the minor variations. Swarthy, chubby guys with greasy ponytails, dirty blonde-haired guys slightly taller than me with shiny Italian suits, etc. I had to assume that the guys Hep had seen had business on the street, were in the skin game or the drug trade, so that ruled out any guy who looked like he was shopping. What does a guy who's shopping look like? Uncomfortable, like he hopes his boss won't see him there, as if his boss being there wouldn't be just as incriminating. Cocky, like he's trying to convince the world that he usually doesn't have to pay for it. Serious, like he thinks everyone will think he has a delivery to make nearby. Ingratiating, like he knows he doesn't have quite enough but is prepared to throw his fake Rolex in on the deal. I had several interactions during the early evening which tested my resolve not to take this personally. I decided that the way to fend off potential tricks was to up my rates. The reaction was uniform. How much? For you? What are you on? Gee, thanks, world. You're right, I told the third one. You don't deserve to have sex that good. Eventually, you'll forget you ever met me and you'll be able to sleep nights again. He just stared at me blankly, turned to Vicky and said, What about you? Her rates were in the ballpark, so to speak. Here's a little taste.
Now thinking what my rates would be. I'd be giving away. I'd be just having to be like, nope, sorry, I'll have to pay you instead.
No, you not if you saw the clientele, you wouldn't.
Ah, true. True, true, true. So there's a lot of things that are going on. So for yourself, outside of writing, when did you realize for yourself that there was something up, that you were going to be different from other people, when the other people around you? You mentioned that, you went through a whiny stage, but you had this fierceness where you got mad. But when did you kind of wake up and go, oh, something's up? Something's up here.
That's an interesting question because I was already the weird kid. I was sick a lot as a kid, which meant I missed a lot of school. That was one reason to consider me sort of an outsider. Plus, I was smart and I liked to talk to the teachers and I liked to give the right answers and I had read lots of books. I remember being accused of cheating in grade 1 because I knew how to read. And even then, I thought that was pretty peculiar because you can't cheat. You can either read or you can't read. But it was still really upsetting as someone who, wanted to be in with the other kids to be hassled and harassed that way. So being the weird kid, being the kid who was chosen last for phys ed teams, you know, because I couldn't run fast and I couldn't just, all that stuff. By the time I got to the point where I thought, oh yeah, I really am queer, that was just another thing, to be honest. I didn't have one of those, oh my God, my life has changed its direction completely. Because I was doomed. I was going to be a writer. I was artistic. I was strange. I had my own sense. Plus, I remember when I came of age. I mean, I was in high school from 1967 to 1970. And if you remember that history in Canada meant that, the Summer of Love in 67 in the US progressed very slowly toward Canada, so that by 1970 we were really in the height of hippiedom, and and then Kent State happened that year, May 4th of that year. Just, you know, anti-Vietnam War, people on campus starting the Students for Democratic Society. It was a time when, frankly, if you didn't experiment with sex, drugs, rock and roll, you were an outsider. If you didn't think of yourself as having many options, you were considered straight and dull and boring. I mean, straight in those days meant not a hippie, right? Not queer, but same difference, right? So I was kind of lucky in that sense. I was never a really good hippie because I wasn't interested in the drugs part, and rock and roll could get really loud and I wanted them to turn it down so I could hear the melody. But I was a great hippie when it came to the sex part, I gotta admit. Oh my, that was many years ago. What a pity, eh? We get too soon old and too late smart.
I'm going to ask you a really tough question, and it's kind of unfair because I hear a lot of our younger crowd, our younger LGBTQ plus community, and there's a disconnect with the older generation that's come before. People who've been part of these committees to try to make the police change. And I hear this phrase often. Well, you didn't do enough. You didn't do everything that was for all people. So, well, that's bad. What is your response to a statement like that? Because that's got to be so hard because you spent almost 20 years fighting these town halls, getting people to change. And then you hear, yeah, you hear these words go on, well, you sucked at it, you didn't do enough. What what do you respond with that?
Well, yeah, that's a good question, and I I'm sad about that disconnect because I want people to understand the historical context. That it's even like historical within received memory. I think it must be natural to think that the problem started when you first faced it, right? The first time you ever uh, confronted prejudice must have been the first time it really occurred, and before then. And there's also a tendency for us to think that if people are dead, they didn't do enough either. They somehow. I actually heard someone at a panel say something about, you know, women in. It was actually about women in art, and it was like those women failed to make art egalitarian, but we won't fail. And I I did not endear myself to her because I stood up and said, look, they didn't fail, they died. You can only do what you do in your life, and and then you die, and someone else takes up the torch. But I was extremely lucky, just at the point where I was a fiery young activist and optimist. A group of us, which included Liz Messiah and Lorna Murray, I can't even remember who all the people were involved, but we brought Jane Rule, the lesbian writer, to Edmonton, and we called it the Jane Rule Tour. It was in the early 1980s, and she wrote. People might remember Desert of the Heart became a movie called Desert Hearts. Um, but she wrote a number of things, and she was in her way a fiery activist. And so she came and she did some readings and speeches and so on. And at one point she said, politics is housework. And she didn't even really have to expand on that. But of course you can expand. I mean, you do the housework and it gets dirty again, right? You can't control activism for success. You can't put controls on it that say, we will fix this and it will stay fixed. Here's an example. In 1979, only 3% of the toys sold in major stores were sold to through gendered marketing. Now, this was as a result of like 20 years of feminist effort in terms of not thinking of girls as pretty in pink and boys in blue. 3% in 1979. In 2000 and something, around 10, I can't remember the exact date, that number was over 50%. So what happened? Did we fail? Or was there a backlash? Was there I call it the return of gender because it absolutely, completely surprised me. And so these days you see young women wearing 5-inch heels and tottering along in these heels, like they're beautiful. They look like sandhill cranes or something. But I remember when the highest heel that anyone ever wore outside the bedroom, being dressed up in Fredericks of Hollywood fetish gear or outside the drag clubs, was like a 3.5-inch heel, and that was a spike heel, right? And those were the heels that women of my era of feminism rebelled against because you can't run away from a rapist in high heels, right? So the whole idea of, don't insist that women be stuck in high heels. So then, how many decades later was it that places like Moxie's and these fancy sort of restaurant, clubby, trendy places were insisting that their young women servers wear high heels as part of their dress code? And young women had to press back and push back against that and say, no, it's not safe. It's, occupational health and safety issues make it ridiculous, right? And we were there pushing with them, but I mean, we're old, and to be honest, old people become invisible to the young, especially old women. And, if you look at young activists and you say you don't have any sexism left in your body, if you're ignoring me because I don't matter, because I'm white haired and old and plump and, and don't look very interesting, then you are not as advanced politically as you think you are. But, my generation of feminists and gay activists, and queer activists, we made changes that have stuck, but we also made changes that got pushed back and got backlashes pushed against. Now, if I hadn't heard Jane Rule when I was something like 27 years old and had heard her say politics is housework, I would be in the depths of despair because we did it and it, quote, didn't work. But the reality is it's housework. Those young people whom I admire, we're going to be fine because there's a generation of young activists who are just smoking hot. They're brilliant. But if they think they're going to fix it, they're doomed to the same disillusionment that a lot of activists go through when they realize it won't stay fixed. So they need to hear that the politics they do is housework, just like the politics we did. And we did what seemed to be radical to us at the time. And the fact that it isn't as radical now is a sign of our success, not of our failure. The fact that young people can pick that baton up and they can go further and they can go faster and they can go better into issues is a sign that they are not starting at zero. They really aren't. So I am totally 100% happy that a young generation is willing to take that baton. Frankly, after 50 years of it, I'm kind of tired. And at the end of my time on the police committee, I was basically restricting myself to that one kind of activism and showing up there because I had done a lot of other things. I was kind of tired. And now, the work I do is different. And some of it, frankly, is in things like this book. You read this book, you can't ignore the bisexual or pansexual heroine. You can't ignore the queer content. You can't ignore the streets. You can't ignore that. And yet you are carried through it by this smart-ass breezy narrator. And then I get in under your radar with the serious shit, basically. And that's how it has to work sometimes. But, I guess I've sort of passionately ranted, but I think that if someone's saying you didn't do enough and writing off their history and the history of their community, they're being very short-sighted because they're standing on the work that the people did in the past, just like we stood on the work that people did before us. We would never have been able to speak as we spoke or do what we did without the people in the 60s, the people in the 50s, the people in the 20s and 10s who were brave. If Quentin Crisp hadn't gone on trial for wearing women's clothing, would, if the queens at Stonewall hadn't pushed back, those people they should be our inspiration, not they didn't push hard enough, And so, let us all. Last thing I'm going to say is, there's that famous expression about those who do not recall their history are doomed to repeat it. But what I find is, if people don't recall their history, I end up being doomed to repeat it over and over. I keep having to say, but we did that and these things happen. So, ask old people about your history, and then you will have a chance not to repeat. And you will have a chance to fly higher and do better. and not just in the queer community either.
We're going to have to come back and talk to you again because there's so much more that we can uncover when it comes to you. For the people who are listening, and I keep saying for the people who are listening, where can we find more information about you as well as the works that you have published?
You can find my books by getting in touch with Audrey's or Glass Bookshop or any independent bookstore, or going to the publishers online. Just use your search engine, and you will find the different publishers. And in theory, you can find out more about me from my website, which is just getting built. So eventually there will be a website at CandasJaneDorsey.ca. Remember to spell my name right, Candas, because otherwise your search won't work as well.
Okay, so if people are looking for an excellent book to read at the moment, take a look at The Adventures of Isabel as it was released at the end of 2020. We didn't even get to it, but we also have, or Candace also has here coming out in May, The Story of My Life Ongoing by C.S. Cobb. So we're going to have to bring you back so you can talk about that in particular. And then in June, you have yet another book that is coming out. And I am missing the title at the moment, and I apologize for that.
It's called The Food of My People.
Food of My People. I'm going to take out that part. And Food of My People, where you were doing some editorial work, I believe.
I co-edited an anthology on the theme of food and speculative fiction with Ursula Flug, and it's coming out from Exile Editions. Food of My People.
And then in the fall, you have yet the sequel for The Adventures of Isabel coming out as well. What's the Matter with Mary Jane? And I feel like that's an hour long topic with going, what is matter with Mary Jane? Let's talk about it.
Well, October 19th, you'll be able to find out what's the matter with Mary Jane.
With this bringing this conversation to an end, I want to thank you for sharing with us your story, your activism, and your passion comes right through the screen. And so I'm very proud of the work that you have done and helping us get to where we are today. That goes beyond your written work, but you as a person has helped us greatly. And I'm going to steal a line from your book. We've never met before, but I never knew you, but you changed my life. And I think that's important for us to make sure that we acknowledge that.
Thank you, and thank you for having me on here. I'm so pleased with what you're doing and to be one of your guests, and so well done, you.
Thank you. Well, we're going to have you back because there's so many more things I want to talk about. So, on behalf of Candace, I want to be able to thank all of you for tuning in today to this episode of Tales of the LGBTQ. Please make sure you press subscribe to be able to see more for what we're able to put out for you. And until then, remember to be good and please text when you get home. Until next time, I'm Douglas Parsons.